Tensegrity is this fascinating principle of structure and force transmission. When we talk about it in the body, we call it biotensegrity. It just means the kind of tensegrity arrangement that we find in biological creatures, so animals and insects and humans. It is an idea that came from Buckminster Fuller, and it includes this idea that a certain architectural arrangement allows for very efficient and even force transmission. Let's look a little bit at the components and how does this happen and what are we talking about? So I have my handy tensegrity model, which is in fact a child's toy. This is where you can find them commonly in the market, and they're not too pricey. Plus they're sort of fun to have around. And what we find with the tensegrity structure is elastic components. So there's a continuous elastic component that surrounds and coordinates stiff components that are suspended within these elastic components, not touching. You'll notice that the wooden pieces here of the toy, which in our bodies are like the bones, the wooden pieces don't touch each other. And in fact, that no matter how, mostly I can use a lot of force and get them to meet. But most of the time, when I apply some force, the elastic members keep the bones from touching each other. And that's true of our soft tissue. So in the body, the elastic members are our ligaments, our muscles, tendons, and what's called fascia, which is wrapping all of those structures. And it's kind of a connective tissue that envelops and connects and wraps all sorts of structures in the body. And they're working in concert with each other. They require each other to function properly. Here's some cool things about tensegrity structures and force transmission. When they're arranged well, one of the things that a tensegrity structure does, I mentioned a little bit, is that it evenly distributes force. So if I compress this structure, it's evenly distributing around all the bones. The soft tissue evenly spreads and shears and opens up. This, from a standpoint of physics, what I'm doing is loading the tissue with kinetic energy. I'm loading it with energy, and then when I release that compression, that energy becomes available in what we call spring, or elasticity, or recoil. And an example of this in the body, every time we step, our upper body and our leg or calf comes into the foot structure, and the foot splays and gives and opens up. The arches are loaded with energy, and then when we push off, that whole structure springs back and gives the leg momentum that carries it forward. Tensegrity is a way of organizing force and then releasing force such that our muscles aren't simply pulleys lifting heavy weights all the time. Our soft tissue actually organizes that force in a very, very efficient way. And when you think about, I might date myself, but when you think about Michael Jordan and he's at the top of the key and he springs off his foot to reach up and just toss that ball up towards the net, that kind of recoil in the tissue is not just muscular effort. There's a whole sort of fascial component with that. That's why tensegrity is really cool. It underpins our sort of optimal function. As a body worker, I also want to be mindful of tensegrity, because when there is something that's not functioning optimally, let's say there's a restriction, and all of a sudden in a certain component, the fascia gets restricted or shortened, it will distort the placement of the bones. And it distorts the give and the ease that the tissue can load. That distortion is something I want to correct. You might notice when we get that distortion also that the tensegrity structure becomes smaller. So part of what we are looking at when we're assessing people is where in their structure have they sort of lost volume, where have they gotten smaller. That might indicate restriction and limited movement and poor force transmission. When I release that, it opens up and regains volume. So often when clients are receiving our work, when they stand up, having received some tissue intervention, they stand up, and a very common thing for them to say is, wow, I feel taller, or I feel bigger, I feel more expansive, I feel lighter. All of those things in an architectural sense are saying, my tensegrity structure is back towards normal, back towards neutral, more available to me. It's one of the ways that I know I'm on track, that the work I'm doing with a client is taking them in the right direction, is if they continue to have that sort of expansive, taller, more open, more free, more buoyant, literal appearance. They will look taller. Probably the last way that tensegrity informs our work is actually in the example of, I'll use the example of the rib cage. If I have restriction, let's say I have a shortening on the left side of my rib cage, and it's significant enough that my whole diaphragm sort of loses some dimension. As a practitioner, I'll be really drawn to the sort of the center and the stiffest part of that restriction. And when I assess, I might find the rib cage on this left side is the place I want to start my work. By comparison, the right side feels kind of free and open, so I'm not as concerned about it. But let's say I start and I open that up on the left side. It then gets free enough and open enough that pretty soon the right side is the side that now is, by comparison, more restricted. Sometimes tensegrity helps us appreciate that we've got this sort of whole geometric shape, that the whole shape is affected, and even though part of it is the center of that restriction, eventually I want to work around all different components, all the bones in the area and all the soft tissue in that area, because there might be milder restrictions that I don't feel at first because they're overshadowed by the primary restriction. And to me, tensegrity is a way that sort of explains, like, how does that happen in the body? How's that working when I'm, noticing and watching people's bodies change over the course of treatment. Tensegrity, biotensegrity, it's sort of a fun idea. It's a fun idea to have in the back of your mind to think about optimal function and kind of arrangement of restriction and how to guide your work helping people achieve balance.